Hello, I am Borja Franco, Associate Professor at the UNED, and I am going to talk about the representation of captives, slaves, and conversos in the Mediterranean. The sea was a space of trade, commerce, war, and also the place for movement of people. There were many population groups that moved to one shore to another, from north to south, from east to west. Historiography has usually focused on portraying the polarization between Muslims and Christians, but is increasingly interested in other individuals who were fundamental in confirming early modern identities, such as captives, slaves, and converts. From the point of view of art history, some scholars started to reflect about these issues, based especially on literary text and the few preserved images. They tried to show how these groups were illustrated by Christian artists. Here, in this session, I will give you a few brief ideas about these representations. We will start with the captives. The image of the captives is totally linked to the orders that were in charge of the redemption, such as Mercedarians and Trinitarians. In other words, their image are subjects to the glorification and economic justification of their key role in the Mediterranean politics. Their ecstasy occurred mainly during the Council of Trent and the following centuries, when a new type of holiness and apostolic action was generated. The position occupied by these captives can vary depending on the intention of the iconographical program, more positive with respect to the Muslims that will be exchanged for Christians, or more intransigent in the try to prove how they never wanted to be converted. Due to the short space of time available to me, I will focus on a brief case study, the vision of Edad Moderna. This alludes to an episode described in the text retained by a known author from the 13th century, where it is narrated how on January 28, 1193, the future saint, while celebrating her first mass, experienced a mystical episode, seeing Christ holding with his hands the two Chinese men, one the form black and the other white. In relation to the iconography, the first representation that you can see in this slide is preserved in the Roman church of St. Thomas in Formis and dates from 1210. Behind it, there is a figurative lagoon until the 17th century, finding some isolated cases in the medieval French context, either for the episode linked to the formation of the order or for the image of St. John of Malta and his collaborator Felix of Valois. As has been said, the position of the hands, who appears Chinese, and the ethnic aspects vary depending on the salvific message, although a constant is usually maintained. The Muslim is shown to be very different from the Christian, accentuating his North African or Ethiopian features, although some of these captives were renegades, so they were Christians, they were ethnically white as the other captive. It seeks to show the difference, as is usual in these cases. You can find this in these examples that were preserved in some Italian churches. You can see how the position of the hands changing depending on the message of the artwork, and how these ethnical features are very exaggerated in both cases. The second point is the representation of slaves. For their part, was mainly linked to the war trophies. We can find them from a very early age in the collective imagination, in the triumphal entrances of the Middle Ages, where kings appear carrying slaves in their parades, or appear under the feet of saints or other royal figures. The intention was not to show initially the concept of slavery with the loss of freedom entailed, but rather the submission and victory of the Christian troops against the infidels. For this reason, it is very interesting to be able to identify these slaves. Hence, we find two possibilities: to do it through racialization, showing them black or with North African features, or on the contrary, to illustrate them as Ottoman Turks, through turbans or through the lock they wore, like slaves, protruding from their shaved head. These kind of images are related not only to the Greek-Roman iconography of the defeated enemy, but also, as it was aforementioned, to the ephemeral royal entries. In fact, in the entry of Alphonse the Magnanimous in Naples in 1443, defeated enemies were fundamental as a counter-image of the king. It was a model for the old Italian triumphi created in the early modern period. This trend continued during the Charles V royal entries, but after the Battle of Lepanto, the humiliation of the Turks' enemy enchained as a slave at the feet of the triumpher became even more popular. You can find here two Genoese representation in which the Battle of Lepanto were represented at the feet of the tapestry. We find the image of this slave. But the most important image is that created by Titian, the allegory of the victory of Lepanto held at the Prado Museum in Madrid. This canvas crystallized an iconographical scheme that will be repeated in several other paintings. He is reproducing this model created in the medieval period, but making even more visible this this victory of the faith against the infidels. These images circulated around the Mediterranean, and this scheme of Muslims at the feet of a ruler gets adapted for monumental sculpture and is found again in the monument of the Four Moors in Leghorn in 1621, when Pietro Tacca created these 4 bronze slaves of different ethnicities to the Carrara marble statue of Ferdinand I de' Medici. The artist was inspired by the physics that he had seen in the port of Leghorn, as well as in the neighboring Bagno dei Forzati, the city prison. His 4 figures represented Chinese, Turkish, and black slaves in different poses and stages of life. Obviously, we can also find other kinds of images of slaves, mainly black, as servants in Samar wars during 16th and 17th century, that still proves the superiority of all Christians against the other. But this topic will be a topic for another video itself. I would like to finish with the Moriscos, the conversos. There are few images of converts from Islam, and none of them produced by Morisco themselves. Between 1501, the year of the first forced conversion, and the contest announced by Philip IV for the best illustration of the Morisco expulsion in 1627, there are only a handful of these representations, and they are all full of contradictions. In general, they are at the remove of the reality that they depict, since most were created by foreigner artists and had a very clear intent, which was not verism or objective portraiture. The earliest of this representation can be found in the polychrome reliefs in the Royal Chapel of Granada, which were produced by Felipe Bigarni in around 1521. They depict the forced conversion of Mudéjares from the former Najd kingdom. While all Christians are shown with white skin, the Moriscos were portrayed as having a range of skin colors, from white to olive tone, as they were described in some contemporaneous sources, and even one black that maybe could be a slave, could be linked to a spectator to North African slaves. This multi-ethnic tableau is framed against 2 different backdrops. First, the reliefs attempt to depict a society of converts that this is the result of 7 centuries of coexistence and ethnic mixtures between the Muslim conquerors and the underlying conquered population. The diversity represented in this relief also corroborates Charles V's universalist ambition. He was inclined even during this period to show that his empire included people of diverse provenance, and that the Caesar placed them all on equal footing as long as they added his empire wealth and glory. Skin color, in this case, had no negative connotations. Interestingly, these reliefs from Granada are followed by a long period of silence on the Moriscos and the visual arts of the Iberian Peninsula. There were just some minor examples until the beginning of the 17th century. In 1609, Philip III published the edicts of expulsion of this minority. And to make visible this decision, the Marquis of Caracena, Viceroy of Valencia, ordered as a present for the king a series of canvases to be painted by different artists showing the Moriscos being banished to North Africa. These well-known canvases, which are now part of the Colección Bancaja and were supposedly cartoons that were to be made into tapestries to be taken with the king and displaying his triumphal entries, show a Morisco very different of the one we talked about before. The Morisco is represented as black are North African tribes that received them in the exiles in Oran. I am of the opinion that this darkening of the skin is intentional, and its intent is to differentiate the Morisco from the old Christian, despite the fact that archival sources and other texts about the period indicate that it was impossible to distinguish one from the other by their appearance. Thus, there is no doubt that the canvases construct a non-existent Morisco, another who is marked by difference solely to justify the political decision to banish him. It is here where the concave mirror that was mentioned by the historiography is represented. The Morisco is as black and North African, and they were not part of the Christian church. So it's imagine Morisco, this figure that travels around the Mediterranean, and other scholars display in this same panel. Summing up, I try to show very briefly how these three groups were represented by Christians over 2 centuries. In some occasions, our work presents a real portrait of the Muslim mother, converted or not. In others, there is a stereotypical view as a propagandistically tool. But all of the prove the variety of population with different religions and social classes that were circulated around the Mediterranean, confirming multi-ethnical and pluriligious societies.